Welcome to the chapter by chapter breakdown of Aristotle's Poetics. In this video, we will go through each section of this timeless work, exploring Aristotle's key concepts about drama, poetry, and storytelling. From his analysis of tragedy to his exploration of character and plot structure, we will unpack the core ideas in each chapter, making them easy to understand and apply. In chapter 1 of Poetics, Aristotle introduces the concept of poetry, which he divides into distinct genres based on the medium, object, and manner of imitation. He begins by discussing poetry as an art form rooted in mimesis, which is imitation, a central concept throughout the work. This chapter sets the foundation for understanding how Aristotle views the function of poetry in relation to human nature and society. Let's start with the chapter 1. The first concept of chapter 1 is mimesis, which is imitation. Aristotle defines poetry as a form of mimesis or imitation of life. However, unlike the literal copying of reality, poetry imitates the actions, emotions, and characters found in human experience, often presenting them in an idealized or dramatized form. This concept of imitation goes beyond simple reproduction. It is about presenting universal truths or moral insights through the portrayal of particular actions. Aristotle emphasizes that humans are naturally drawn to imitation. From early childhood, humans learn by imitating the behaviors of others, and this instinct is an essential part of the human psyche, making poetry and drama relatable and meaningful. In the next concept, he talks about genres of poetry. Aristotle identifies several genres of poetry, each distinguished by its medium, object, and manner of imitation. The three primary genres discussed are epic poetry, tragedy, and comedy. In epic poetry, according to Aristotle, the poetry involves the narration of grand historical and mythical events in verse form. The epic is characterized by its use of a narrative medium and often includes a grand scale of time and space. Tragedy is a genre of poetry that dramatizes human sufferings, focusing on the downfall of a noble or virtuous character. It is intended to invoke pity and fear in the audience, leading to catharsis. And the last one, comedy, deals with the portrayal of ordinary, often humorous situations and the contrast between characters of different moral qualities. It is kind of lighter than tragedy, aiming to entertain and provoke laughter. The third concept is purpose of poetry. Aristotle states that the purpose of poetry is not merely to entertain, but to provide moral lessons, evoke emotions, and reveal universal truths about human nature. Through imitation, poetry becomes a vehicle for exploring complex human experiences such as virtue, vice, and the consequences of actions. Aristotle believes that by engaging with poetry, the audience is able to achieve catharsis, an emotional purification, that allows them to process their own emotions in safe and controlled environment. And the fourth one is the relationship between poetry and philosophy. And in this chapter, Aristotle hints at the relationship between poetry and philosophy. While philosophy deals with abstract truths and general principles, poetry can focus on particular instances and representations of human behavior, making it a form of practical knowledge. Aristotle does not elevate poetry as superior to philosophy, but he views it as a distinct and valuable form of knowledge that complements philosophical inquiry. The next one is imitation of actions. One of the key points Aristotle makes in chapter 1 is that poetry, especially tragedy, imitates actions, specifically human actions that involve moral choices and consequences. These actions are central to the plot structure of poetic works and provide the foundation for character development. In tragedy, the actions of characters are often depicted as arising from their desires, fears, and flaws, leading to dramatic consequences. Aristotle suggests that the most important feature of a tragedy is the plot, followed by character development and the portrayal of moral struggles. And the next important concept is universality versus particularity. Aristotle contrasts poetry with history by stating that poetry deals with the universal, whereas history focuses on the particular. While a historian recounts specific events that happened in the past, a poet presents generalized, often idealized versions of those events. Poetry in Aristotle's view is more philosophical than history, because it aims at universal truths, not just facts about particular times and places. In other words, poetry expresses what could happen according to human nature, while history records what did happen. Let's move on to the next topic, the key concepts of chapter 2. The first concept is imitation of actions. Aristotle begins by noting that poetry, particularly drama, imitates actions. Actions are central to human experience, and poetry aims to represent these actions in a way that highlights the moral and emotional consequences they produce. In mimesis, actions are not just depicted in their physical form but also in their deeper and moral implications. This imitation allows the audience to reflect on the nature of these actions, their causes, and outcomes. In the next concept, the role of character, he says, building on the concept of action, he states that poetry also imitates characters, specifically the qualities of those characters that drive the actions. In dramatic context, the characters' virtues, flaws, and motivations are revealed through their choices and actions. The characters in a tragedy are typically distinguished by their moral and psychological complexity. They are often defined by a single hamartia, a tragic flaw, which leads to their downfall. The complexity of character representation enhances the moral and emotional depth of tragedy. In the third concept, the purpose of imitating actions and character. Aristotle emphasizes that primary purpose of imitating action and character is to teach moral lessons and provoke emotional responses. By representing characters in moral dilemmas and showing the consequences of their actions, poetry serves as both a form of education and an emotional experience. Tragedy, in particular, aims to purify the emotions of the audience by making them feel pity and fear for the characters. Through catharsis, the purging of the emotions, audience can gain a deeper understanding of human nature and morality. The next concept is the imitation of emotions. Aristotle briefly touches on the imitation of emotions in poetry, noting that the portrayal of emotions such as fear, anger, and love is essential to creating a resonant narrative. However, he primarily focuses on how these emotions are tied to actions and characters, making them secondary to the portrayal of moral and psychological conflict. The emotions expressed in poetry, particularly in tragedy, are not merely meant to evoke a reaction, but to engage the audience in reflecting on human condition. In the fifth concept, genres and mode of imitation, Aristotle distinguishes between different genres of poetry based on the mode of imitation. For example, tragedy imitates actions and characters through drama, where the audience witnesses the events as if they were real, whereas epic poetry narrates events in more detached and descriptive manner. In tragedy, the action is often shown through dialogue and performance, allowing the audience to directly engage with the emotions and actions of the characters. In contrast, epic poetry relies on narration to describe actions and characters, giving the poet more flexibility in presenting events. And the sixth concept is the role of language and style. Although Aristotle does not go into extensive detail in chapter 2 about the style of language and poetry, he touches on its significance in conveying actions, characters, and emotions effectively. The choice of diction, meter, and rhythm helps to elevate the emotional impact and moral weight of imitation. The language of poetry must be appropriate to the action and the character it represents. For example, a heroic character would speak in a noble and elevated manner, while a comic character might use more colloquial language. The style of language reinforces the emotional and thematic aspect of the work. So we can say that in this chapter, Aristotle further refines his idea of poetry as an art of mimesis. While chapter 1 introduced the general concept of imitation, chapter 2 goes deeper into the mechanisms of how poetry imitates life through the portrayal of actions, characters, and emotions. Aristotle highlights the moral and educational purposes of poetry, particularly in tragedy, where the depiction of human struggle is intended to provoke emotional responses that leads to catharsis. Aristotle also emphasizes that the representation of actions and characters must not be arbitrary, but should adhere to a sense of moral and psychological coherence. This aligns with the broader view that poetry is a vehicle for understanding human nature and the consequences of human choices. In chapter 3 of Aristotle's Poetics, Aristotle further elaborates on the concept of mimesis or imitation, focusing on the ways in which different kinds of poetry imitate different aspects of life. Here he differentiates between the various forms of poetic imitation, notably between the epic and tragic, and outlines the role of poetry in evoking emotional responses in the audience. This chapter provides a deeper understanding of the mechanisms behind the art of imitation and sets the stage for Aristotle's later discussions of plot and character in tragedy. So the key concepts of chapter 3 are: first one is the differences between the types of poetry. Aristotle argues that poetry can take many forms, and the key differences between them lie in the object, manner, and medium of imitation. He distinguishes between epic poetry, tragic poetry, and lyric poetry, each of which has its own characteristics and techniques for imitating life. In epic poetry, we can call it a narrative form that often tells the grand stories typically involving heroes, gods, and significant historical events. It is particularly concerned with the action and events within a large scope, frequently covering vast spans of time and geography. The epic poet represents the action from a distance through narration rather than dramatic representation. But in tragic poetry, tragedy it represents dramatic form of imitation where the events are enacted on stage. In tragedy, the plot focuses on the downfall of the protagonist, often due to the tragic flaw or error in judgment that is called as hamartia. The audience is directly engaged through performance and is meant to experience the emotions of pity and fear. In lyric poetry, is a form that is typically personal and emotional, often expressing feelings of love, grief, and joy. It is not discussed in detail in chapter 3, but it contrasts with the more narrative and dramatic forms of poetry discussed by Aristotle. The second concept is medium of imitation. Aristotle emphasizes that different forms of poetry use different mediums for imitation. The medium of an art form refers to the mode in which it is expressed. For example, tragedy and comedy employ dramatic performance, actions on stage, actors are on stage, while epic poetry uses narration, the poet telling the story. The medium of imitation is crucial because it shapes the way the audience experiences the narrative. In tragedy, the use of dramatic action creates a more immediate and immersive experience, while in epic poetry, the audience is more distanced from the events as they are narrated by the poet. The third concept is manner of imitation. Aristotle also introduces the idea of manner of imitation, which refers to the way in which the actions or events are depicted. In tragedy, the events are shown directly through the actions of the characters, while in epic poetry, they are told through the poet's narration. The manner of imitation in tragedy allows for a more vivid emotional engagement as the audience witnesses the characters' actions unfold before them. In contrast, the epic poetry tells the story, often summarizing or presenting events at a higher level of abstraction. The fourth concept is the emotional impact of tragedy. Aristotle briefly addresses the emotional effects of tragedy, explaining that the tragic form is particularly effective at causing pity and fear from the audience. These emotions arise from the portrayal of a noble character's downfall, which is often caused by a tragic flaw that is termed as hamartia. The emotional response in tragedy is designed to lead to catharsis, a purging of these emotions, providing the audience with a sense of relief and moral clarity after experiencing the emotional intensity of the play. The fifth concept is the role of the poet. Aristotle acknowledges the unique role of the poet in shaping these emotional responses. The poet must craft a plot that is capable of drawing out the appropriate emotions in the audience. For tragedy, this means creating a narrative in which the downfall of the protagonist is both inevitable and tragic, provoking the desired emotional reactions. The poet must also ensure that the action, character, and moral implications are connected in a way that feels organic and believable, allowing the audience to sympathize with the characters while also reflecting on the broader moral lessons. So, to analyze chapter 3, we can say that it further develops Aristotle's theory of mimesis by distinguishing between different forms of poetic imitation. The distinction between epic and tragic poetry in particular sets the stage for Aristotle's later discussions on the structure of tragedy, plot, and character. While both epic and tragic poetry are concerned with imitating actions and events, are in their medium. Narration versus drama, and manner of presentation, telling versus showing. So, this chapter is important because it frames the kind of engagement poetry has with its audience, whether distant, as in epic poetry, or immediate and immersive as in tragedy. Aristotle's examination of emotional impact of tragedy, particularly how it invokes pity and fear, also sets the tone for his exploration of emotional and moral purposes of tragedy in later chapters. Ultimately, chapter 3 establishes the different ways that poetry can imitate life, while also pointing to the specific emotional and moral effects that these forms can have on an audience. We will cover the next chapters in the upcoming videos. Thank you so much for watching. Please like, share and subscribe.